I'd like to invite the Amen group to stand up now and take the lead in reading our scripture lesson, but please follow along in your own bulletin. It is absolutely clear that God has called you to a free life. Just make sure that you don't use this freedom as an excuse to do whatever you want to do and destroy your freedom.
Rather use your freedom to serve one another in love. That's how freedom grows. For everything we know about God's Word is summed up in a single sentence. Love others as you love yourself. That's an act of true freedom.
If you fight and ravage each other, watch out. In no time at all, you will be annihilating each other. And where will your precious freedom be then?
But what happens when we live God's way? God brings gifts into our lives, much the same way that fruit appears in the orchard. Things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity.
We develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people.
We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life, able to marshal and direct our energies wisely.
Since this is the kind of life we have chosen, the life of the Spirit, let us make sure that we do not just hold it as an idea in our heads or a sentiment in our hearts, but work out its implications in every detail of our lives.
That means we will not compare ourselves to each other as if one of us were better and another worse. We have far more interesting things to do with our lives. Each of us is an original.
Thank you. Amen. Don't you love that last line? Far more interesting things to do with our lives. About 10 years ago, when our son Dylan was a sophomore at George School, Martin Luther King Day lectures and seminars were planned and classes were canceled. Dylan asked if he could skip all that and go to Philadelphia with his girlfriend to buy some new ballet shoes for her. I was ambivalent, and I said, well, all right, as long as you come back and you write me a one-page essay about Martin Luther King. He wrote the essay, but looking back, that was one of those moments of parental weakness. Why did I let him off the hook when I'm sure he would have had more going on inside him in response to the events that were taking place at school, as opposed to doing his own Google search? Well, I think it's because it was a time when racism was not my issue. I vaguely thought it should be, but it had not come to my doorstep personally. Not long after that, at Princeton Seminary, where I work, I was asked to choose either to get involved with some coordinating of women's ministry kinds of things, or get involved with a new initiative related to race and learning about cultural humility and all of that. There had been a few mishandled race-related controversies at the seminary around that time, which had sparked a frighteningly large reaction. And I also was aware that more students of color were coming to our seminary. And as the director of student counseling, I wanted to have more comfort and more capacity to really be able to support them in a sensitive way. So I chose to engage with the Multicultural Training Initiative rather than the women's issues, and I never had a moment's second thought about that. The seminary hired a team from California to come in and worked with all the constituents at our school for about 5 years, teaching us about race, cultural humility, diversity, competency, skills, privilege, power. I spent hours in workshops, I read books, attended countless planning meetings, helped create our Courageous Conversations program. I also participated in some deeply uncomfortable but eye-opening trainings in New York City, where I was the white-skinned minority in the group discussing race. I learned that I did not know what I didn't know, and I would only know if I kept opening my curiosity, my heart, and the pocketbook of my time to learn about these things. So it was a next right step for me to engage with some of you somewhere around 4 years ago in creating the Amen group. It was kind of a time I preached actually on Martin Luther King Sunday around that time, and that planted some seeds for me and for some others. So we then began to meet and think about what do we want to do as a church to learn more and to be just more engaged. I grew up in a house which had a stairway up to the bedrooms upstairs, and the landing at the bend halfway up was a good place to spy on anything going on in the living room. It was also a place from which to make a quick leap toward the bedroom if we were caught spying. I can look back and see the largely ignorance is bliss, I have to hold this up, place from which I came in terms of these issues of race at the bottom of the stairs, so to speak. And I can see how I have changed as I've taken one creaky step after another up to this landing where I kind of have a sense I am now. Looking ahead, I know there is so much more to learn as I keep climbing the steps in this territory to the end of my days and beyond, I'm sure. But as I've explored my own history, the truth is I realize that my interest in racial and social justice certainly began well before a decade ago. My first quarter at Stanford University in 1972, I chose a writing class called The Trickster in African American Mythology, where for the first time I was in the minority in the classroom. And equally jarring for me, thanks to that professor, was discovering that despite all those A's in high school English classes, I really didn't know how to write. I did also take a class that freshman first quarter called, with a famous law professor, where I also nearly drowned. This course was called, Can the Poor Achieve Justice and Equal Treatment Through the Legal System? Sadly, the answer to that question, still nearly 50 years later, is not really, especially not for poor people of color. Looking further back, I realized that growing up, and really all through seminary even, there are a lot of things I never learned in the classes in history, government, poli-sci, ethics, and so on. I never learned anything substantial or balanced about how white settlers and the US government pushed Native Americans off their land and stripped them of their identities and culture. I also didn't really learn anything about things like the slaves, on whose backs our economy and the wealth of many families was built. We did study the Revolutionary War, but we didn't really learn that some of the founding fathers had slaves, and that the Constitution's language about freedom and justice for all really didn't mean for all. I can tell you that I don't remember ever learning about any other black person of note except Martin Luther King. As you may know, the first slave arrived on American soil in 1619. And now in 2019, 400 years later, we're still on the edge of coming to terms with racism. In August, the president of Princeton Seminary appointed a task force to study the seminary's relationship with slavery. The slavery audit was published this fall, and since then we've had a number of opportunities to reflect on it and to think about responses to it. The seminary was founded in 1812, so there's been rumor that some of the first buildings, which we still use as dorms and the classrooms, were built by slaves. It turns out that the report shows this was not the case, but it was discovered that at least one of the first few professors owned slaves, and a building is still named after him. 2 professors actively advocated returning slaves to Africa, even slaves born in the United States, because they didn't believe whites and blacks could live well together. The largest connection between our seminary and slavery was financial. Plantation owners who prospered because of slave labor gave money to the Presbyterian Church, which supported Princeton Seminary in those early days, still does. The seminary invested those funds and other funds well, and we are one of the most heavily endowed seminaries in the country. really quite dependent on our endowment. Just this past Thursday, the entire seminary was invited to have a free lunch and bring that lunch into the dining hall and have conversations around the table about this slavery audit and what responses we could make as a seminary to what it tells us. All kinds of ideas were voiced, such as requiring a class focused on the history of race in America and the seminary's connections with slavery. Another idea was to more fully fund African American initiatives and scholarships for African American students and students from Africa. Names of buildings may be changed, and hopefully training about race and privilege will be an ongoing requirement for all members of the seminary community forever and ever. And many more ideas came up which will be considered. While these steps cannot change the past, they will do a lot to provide a new degree of ownership and some reparation. And they will help those who are being formed as Christian leaders to have motivation and capacity to address the systemic issues of race and justice today. But enough about Princeton Seminary. What about you and me? In the last decade, I have challenged my unconscious assumption that white skin and culture is normative and everything else is other. It's kind of hard to acknowledge these kinds of things that we have held without knowing we've held them, but it's a necessary part of the process. In truth, no culture is normative. Our experiences are shaped by the intersection of so many factors, skin color being one, but also the family cultures we were born into, our gender identity, sexual orientation, education, the financial status of our parents, where we grew up, and our abilities and disabilities. No two of us are alike. The recent fascination with DNA testing is about discovering our personal histories and our cultural backgrounds. We're all multicultural, and race itself is not monochromatic. Within races, there are lots of differences. Each person has a story. Individuals and cultures are alive with flavor, texture, humor, pathos, and preciousness. Where would music be without Negro spirituals, gospel songs, jazz, blues, and my personal favorite, Motown? If you've not had a chance to visit the African American Museum or the Native American Museum in DC, you are in for an impactful experience. Race matters, and it's not something to fear, it's something to learn about and celebrate. And racism matters, but it is something to eliminate. We all love the gospel song, "We Shall Overcome Someday," which became associated with the Civil Rights Movement in 1959. Unfortunately, racism is so embedded in the American psyche and in our systems and institutions that someday will not come without the conversion of whites and Christians using their freedom and privilege as partners in overcoming racism. And as we've seen almost daily in recent years, racism is far too damaging of lives, of families, and of society to say, ho-hum, we'll overcome this someday. We cannot ignore, minimize, or just react to the headlines with guilt, disbelief, and paralysis. So what can we do? I'd like to share a few insights, especially directed to those of us who are white, from a Sounds True lecture by Conda Mason, who is an African-American activist and educator. Conda says white people need to own the fact of privilege. Privilege is not an attitude, nor is it a prejudice, so it's not something about which to feel guilty. Privilege is an unearned special right, an advantage or an immunity granted only to certain people by the system of racial inequality into which we were all born. So what does that mean as the rubber hits the road? It means that, unlike black parents, I did not have to teach my white son Dylan to keep his hands visible on the dashboard if he's pulled over by a police officer. This is illustrated in the film The Hate You Give, which we'll be working with in the adult class during Lent. As a white person, I'll never be pulled over like my 80-year-old black friend Owen. Despite several master's degrees and a distinguished work history, Owen was pulled over a few years ago because a police officer noticed the color of his skin and assumed he was up to no good in that mainline upscale neighborhood. But actually, he was just returning to his own home. When I've gotten or not gotten a job, it never crossed my mind that my race might have been a factor. Privilege is structural and fluid. All of us at times are privileged, and at times not privileged. When I was an exchange student in Holland in 1972, Peyton Place reruns were inexplicably to me a favorite of Dutch people. And after that, it was Baywatch. Yuck. These shows reveal the shallowest subculture of America. My Dutch peers were also uniformly informed and opposed to the Vietnam War at that time. I could sense their distrust and, in some cases, some disdain for me as an American. But until I learned Dutch, there was nothing I could do to undo that stereotype, at least with one person, that Americans were wealthy, self-centered, and superficial. Maybe sex-crazed also, if you look at those two shows. Looking back, I realized that this taught me what it's like to be without the privilege of a shared language and to be viewed through the lens of negative stereotypes, which I didn't feel really fit me, or most of the people I know. But you might protest, okay, I'm white, so I have privilege by definition, but that doesn't make me a racist. And nothing was given to me. I've worked for everything I have. Anyway, I don't see color. We are all one, like it says in the Bible. And besides, I try to stay out of the conversations about race so I don't say something wrong or hurt somebody. I had most of these thoughts myself a decade ago, which is how I allowed myself to just dodge racism as not my issue. So I'm going to unpack these ideas, which are common to perfectly lovely but clueless white Americans. First of all, being a human and raised in the United States, it would be hard not to have absorbed some racist values. The Galatians passage says, "Do not compare yourselves with each other as if one is better and another worse. We have more interesting things to do with our lives." Boy, I love that statement. But it's true that looking down on others seems to come so naturally to our species. This is even so among the most disenfranchised in society. I remember a documentary about grocery stores on the corners in Los Angeles, and there was a pecking order between those run by Black individuals, those run by Asian individuals, and those run by Hispanic individuals. There was a lot of competition and kind of a bitterness between them. We just need to watch for that default of judgment in ourselves. What about the defense I worked for everything I have? People in the dominant culture who say this are not lying, but they're overlooking something important. The truth is that the starting line in life is different for white people than for people of color. In many settings, it's different for men than it is for women, as we see in the film recently about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice. And it's been even more difficult for women of color, as we saw in that wonderful film, the name of which escapes me, about the women who helped put men on the moon. Anybody got that title?
Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures, thank you. All right, $400. The starting line for heterosexuals is different than for LGBTQI individuals. The starting line for those born in poor families is completely different than for children who grew up in middle or upper class homes. Those with less privilege just have to work harder than other people to break through barriers and get to the starting line. Our Galatians passage says that when we live God's way, God gives us a compassionate heart and a willingness to stick with things and the ability to marshal and direct our energies wisely. We're to use our freedom and capacities to serve one another as partners, leveling these playing fields. All right, so what about not seeing color? I used to think being colorblind was a good thing. But I have learned that when I overlook color, I overlook the hurtful experiences people have based on skin color. I overlook systemic injustice when I overlook color. I overlook the fact that white is itself a color. And of course, I do not actually see the person if I don't see their color. Just because white is my norm and I'm part of the dominant culture doesn't mean white is the norm. In fact, I've discovered that I'm on the outside of the rich worlds that people of color and people from other cultures inhabit. As the Galatians text says, there is a basic holiness permeating all things and all people of all colors and ethnicities and orientations. Last Saturday, I went to a drumming retreat in Bethlehem, which was attended by 20 white women, mostly in their 50s and 60s. I wondered about the mailing list and other factors that might have led to that narrow demographic. And I noticed that I felt disappointed that there were no women of color there. In the past, I would have noticed women or men of color in a group, certainly the farther past, but now I come to notice their absence, and I'm dismayed by it, because I know of the richness that comes as different people bring different gifts to the party. And to address that last piece of resistance, of course we don't want to make mistakes in our conversations and offend people, but a sincere apology for a microaggression does go some distance. We can't just say, I didn't mean that, my intentions were good and you misunderstood. We have to respond to the impact of our words and actions, even though our intentions were good. And if we want to become more comfortable in multiracial settings and in conversations about race, we have to risk revealing the splinter that we don't even know is in our own eye. This is part of learning and stretching ourselves. The more we read, attend lectures, watch films, talk with people, and otherwise study racism, the less anxiety and the more urgency we feel to protect race and dismantle racism. In addition to educating ourselves and seeking opportunities for advocacy and partnering, there are always small kindnesses we can offer in our daily lives. Small things are not nothing. As Wayne Muller wrote, what if the healing of the world utterly depends on the 10,000 invisible kindnesses we offer simply and quietly throughout the pilgrimage of our lives? I think we all along experience the longing for all are one. Paul warns the potential for all one could be a convenient spiritual bypass. Yes, we're all one, all equal in God's eyes. And there's so many similarities in our hopes, our fears, our dreams, our loves, our longings. The differences sometimes just seem unimportant. And they are, in a certain sense. But that lens shields us from seeing the ways that racism and privilege keeps us from being one. It can lull us into sitting on our hands rather than getting involved in loyal commitments, to use Paul's phrase. So to summarize what I was just saying, here are some things we can do. We can own the privilege we do have related to color and other givens. We can look for the hidden judgment and racist thoughts in ourselves. We can help level the playing field and address unequal starting lines. We can value color and not assume color blindness is a virtue. We can be brave and own the impact, not just the intent, when we do offend. We can embrace and work for all are one, but not let it be an anesthesia. We can focus on the next right, small kindness that is ours to do. I'll close with Paul's challenge and encouragement to the Galatian Christians. Since this is the kind of life we have chosen, the life of the Spirit, let us make sure that we do not just hold it as an idea in our heads or a sentiment in our hearts, but work out its implications in every detail of our lives. No more comparing ourselves with each other. We have far more interesting things to do with our lives. And besides, each of us is an original. You are an original, one of many, one with many, and one with God, with all the power of one, and we, and the Spirit. May we use the strengths of our particular faith, place, and race, and race together to erase racism. Amen.